July 7, 1972. 26-year-old Phyllis Bailer kissed her neighbors goodbye in Indianapolis. She buckled her 3-year-old daughter into their brown sedan for a simple summer drive to Bluffton. The roads were quiet. The evening was warm. Trust filled every mile. By dawn, that trust was shattered. A passing driver found their abandoned car on a rural Wells County road. Inside sat a frightened child, alive but alone. Nearby, officers discovered Phyllis's body. She had been assaulted and shot. The small-town peace dissolved into fear. Mothers locked their doors. Farmers watched empty roads. One question echoed through every household. For 53 years, that question haunted Indiana. Detectives retired. Evidence gathered dust. Hope faded. Then, in 2024, science finally caught up to faith. DNA genealogy traced distant relatives through public databases. The trail led to one man, Fred Allen Lieneman. But the greatest twist was yet to come. What happens when the killer you've spent decades hunting is already dead? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The morning sun painted Indianapolis in golden hues. Phyllis Bailer hummed softly as she packed snacks into a brown paper bag. Crackers for the drive, apple slices for her daughter, a thermos of sweet tea for herself, the simple ritual of a mother preparing for a family visit. Her neighbors waved from their front porch. "Drive safe, honey," called Mrs. Henderson. "Tell your folks we said hello." Phyllis smiled and waved back. She lifted her 3-year-old daughter into the back seat, securing the safety belt with gentle hands. The child clutched her teddy bear, eyes bright with the promise of adventure. "Ready for Grandma's house?" Phyllis asked, adjusting the rear-view mirror. The little girl nodded eagerly. The brown sedan pulled away from the curb. Phyllis checked her watch. If traffic stayed light, they would reach Bluffton before dark. The July evening stretched ahead, full of promise and ordinary happiness. She merged onto Highway 27 as the sun began its slow descent toward the Indiana horizon. Miles passed in comfortable silence. Phyllis glanced back occasionally to check on her daughter, who had fallen asleep clutching her teddy bear. The rural landscape rolled by in waves of green corn and golden wheat. Farmhouses dotted the distance like islands of light. As darkness gathered, Phyllis noticed tire tracks in the gravel where the road curved through a wooded area. Her headlights swept across empty fields. She slowed, checking her map against the road signs. The area felt isolated. Too quiet. A vehicle appeared in her rearview mirror, headlights growing closer. She tried to speed up, but her car sputtered. Engine trouble at the worst possible moment. Phyllis pulled to the roadside, hands trembling as she turned on her hazard lights. She looked back at her sleeping daughter, then at the approaching vehicle. "Please let this be someone who wants to help," she whispered. The headlights stopped behind her car. Dawn broke gray and cold over Wells County. Farmer Joe Mitchell drove his pickup along the rural road, heading to check his cornfields. Something caught his eye near the curve. A brown sedan sat abandoned, hazard lights still blinking weakly. Mitchell pulled over and approached cautiously. Through the rear window, he saw a small child in the back seat, awake but silent, clutching a teddy bear with wide, frightened eyes. "Jesus," he whispered, yanking open the door. "Hey there, sweetheart. Are you okay?" The little girl stared at him without speaking. Mitchell scooped her up gently, his work-rough hands surprisingly tender. He looked around for the child's parents. The front seat was empty. The keys still hung in the ignition. "Where's your mama, honey?" The child pointed toward the tree line. Mitchell carried her to his truck and radioed the sheriff's office. Within 23 minutes, cruisers arrived with sirens wailing. Officers spread out to search the surrounding area. They found Phyllis Bailer's body in a ditch 30 yards from the road. She had been assaulted and shot. The peaceful morning shattered into something dark and unforgivable. Sheriff Bob Jenkins knelt beside the body, his face grim. He had known this family, had gone to school with Phyllis's brother. This wasn't supposed to happen in Wells County. "Somebody call the state boys," he said quietly. "This is bigger than we can handle." The child sat in the patrol car, still clutching her teddy bear, while investigators worked the scene. Social workers arrived to care for her. Medical examiners photographed everything. The rural road became a crime scene that would echo through decades. News traveled fast in small towns. By noon, reporters had descended on Wells County like vultures. Television crews parked their vans outside the sheriff's office. Radio stations interrupted regular programming with breaking bulletins. The Indianapolis Star ran the headline, "Mother Killed, Child Survives on Rural Road." The story spread across Indiana and beyond. A young mother's life cut short. A 3-year-old witness to unimaginable horror. Phyllis's family gathered at her parents' house in Bluffton. Her mother sat in stunned silence, holding the granddaughter who was supposed to visit that evening. Her father paced the living room, demanding answers from anyone who would listen. "Who would do this?" he asked the assembled relatives. "Phyllis never hurt anybody. She was coming to see us. Just a simple visit. The local newspaper editor, a man named Harold Chen, tried to make sense of the senseless. His evening editorial read, "Evil visited our quiet county yesterday. It stole a daughter, a mother, a neighbor. We must not let fear win. We must find justice for Phyllis Bailer." But fear had already taken root. Mothers called their children inside early. Farmers checked their property lines twice before dark. The trust that binds small communities began to fray. Sheriff Jenkins stood before the cameras, his uniform pressed, but his eyes tired. "We will find who did this," he promised. "Phyllis Bailer deserves justice. Her family deserves answers. We won't rest until we have both." Behind his confident words, Jenkins felt the weight of uncertainty. In 1972, forensic science was limited. They had shell casings, some fibers, and biological evidence, but without clear suspects, the case could go cold fast. Detective Ray Morrison arrived from the Indiana State Police. A 20-year veteran with a reputation for thorough work, he took charge of the evidence collection. Every item was carefully cataloged and stored. He examined the shell casings found near Phyllis's body. 3 spent rounds from a .38 caliber pistol. The gun was probably common, owned by hundreds of people in the region. Fibers from the perpetrator's clothing clung to Phyllis's dress. Dark wool, possibly from a work jacket. Again, not unusual for rural Indiana in July. The biological evidence was more promising. Advances in blood typing might help narrow the field of suspects. Morrison carefully sealed each sample in manila envelopes, writing the date and location in precise handwriting. "Doc, what can you tell me?" he asked the medical examiner. "She fought back, Doctor," Williams replied. "Defensive wounds on her hands, material under her fingernails. This wasn't random. There was a struggle." Morrison nodded grimly. He walked the crime scene again, trying to reconstruct the events. Phyllis had been forced from her car, probably at gunpoint. She was taken to the ditch and killed there. The killer left quickly, not bothering to move the vehicle. Either he was interrupted or he simply didn't care about being discovered. Morrison returned to his evidence bag, labeled Case #720 to 7084. Inside were the shell casings that might someday speak for Phyllis Bailer. He sealed the bag carefully and drove it to the state crime lab. It was a start, but in 1972, it felt like too little against too much darkness. Over the following weeks, Detective Morrison and local officers interviewed dozens of people. They talked to ex-convicts with violent histories. They questioned drifters who had been seen in the area. They followed up on reports of suspicious vehicles. Morrison filled yellow legal pads with interview notes. Most led nowhere. A few seemed promising until they collapsed under scrutiny. One man claimed he had seen Phyllis arguing with someone at a gas station. When pressed for details, his story changed. Another witness reported a strange car parked near the crime scene the previous day. The license plate he remembered belonged to a school bus. "People want to help," Morrison told Sheriff Jenkins, "but memory plays tricks. Fear makes folks see things that weren't there." They checked employment records at local factories. They visited farms where seasonal workers might be staying. They ran down rumors about hitchhikers and suspicious strangers. Each interview was documented carefully. Each alibi was verified when possible. Morrison knew that somewhere in those yellow pages might be the key to justice, but finding it felt like searching for a needle in a haystack. The most promising lead came from a truck driver who had been on Highway 27 that night. He remembered seeing a brown sedan pulled over with its hazard lights on. A larger vehicle was parked behind it. "Looked like someone helping with car trouble," the driver said. "Didn't think much of it at the time." Morrison pressed for details. "Make of the vehicle? License plate? Description of the people involved?" The trucker shook his head. "It was getting dark. I was making good time and didn't want to stop. Wish I had now." Morrison added the trucker's statement to his growing file. It confirmed the timeline but provided no new leads. Somewhere in Indiana, a killer was walking free, probably believing he had gotten away with murder. The investigation would continue, but as summer turned to autumn, hope began to fade. Social worker Linda Santos sat across from Phyllis's daughter in a small office at the Wells County Courthouse. The child had been staying with relatives, but the trauma was evident. She rarely spoke above a whisper. She startled at sudden noises. Sleep brought nightmares. "Can you tell me about the car ride with Mommy?" Santos asked gently. The little girl clutched her teddy bear tighter. "Mommy said we were going to Grandma's." "That's right. Do you remember stopping along the way?" A small nod. "The car made funny noises. Did anyone come to help?" The child's eyes grew distant. "A man," Mommy said. "Don't be scared." Santos waited patiently. Getting details from a 3-year-old witness required infinite care. Too much pressure could contaminate memories or cause further trauma. "Was the man nice?" The child shook her head slowly. "Mommy was scared after. She told me it would be okay." Those were among Phyllis's last words, a mother comforting her daughter, even as danger closed in. Santos made notes in her report, documenting the fragments of memory that might someday help solve the case. The child's testimony was limited by her age and trauma, but it confirmed that Phyllis had encountered someone on that rural road, someone who had frightened her despite initially appearing to offer help. Santos arranged for the child to receive counseling. Growing up with such memories would be difficult enough without professional support. The family was loving and stable, but this was beyond their experience. "Will the bad man come back?" the child asked during one session. Santos chose her words carefully. "The police are looking for him. Your family will keep you safe." It was the best answer she could give. The truth was that nobody knew where the killer was, or whether he might strike again. In a case with so few leads, anything was possible. The child's trauma would heal slowly, but her memory of that night would remain, locked away until she was old enough to help investigators piece together what had happened on that dark road in Wells County. December snow covered the roads where Phyllis Bailer had taken her last drive. Detective Morrison sat in his office, reviewing the case file one more time before the year ended. 6 months of investigation had produced volumes of paperwork, but no arrests. The evidence bags sat in a locked cabinet, carefully preserved but frustratingly silent. Shell casings that couldn't be matched to any registered weapon, fibers that led to no particular suspect, biological samples that were decades away from meaningful analysis. Morrison had pursued every lead, interviewed every potential witness, checked every alibi. The yellow legal pads filled a cardboard box, but the killer remained a ghost. Sheriff Jenkins knocked on the office door. "Any new developments?" Morrison shook his head. "Dead ends everywhere. Unless something breaks loose, this one's going cold." Without witnesses or clear physical evidence linking a specific suspect to the crime, they were running on hope and determination alone. "What about the state lab?" "They're working on it. But with the technology we have now, there's only so much they can do. Maybe someday science will catch up to this case." Morrison closed the file folder and placed it in his desk drawer. On the cover, he had written case #720 to 7084, Phyllis Bailer in black ink. Below that, he added a note, "Until something new." Christmas came quietly to Wells County that year. Phyllis's family gathered for the holidays, but her absence dominated every moment. The 3-year-old survivor played with new toys while relatives watched protectively. The killer was still out there somewhere, probably celebrating the season as if nothing had happened. Morrison spent Christmas Eve at home with his own family, but his thoughts kept returning to the unsolved case. Somewhere in Indiana, a murderer was going unpunished. A family was grieving without closure. A little girl was growing up without her mother. The detective promised himself he would never stop looking for answers. Cases might go cold, but they didn't have to stay cold forever. Technology would improve. New evidence might surface. Witnesses might remember crucial details years later. Justice for Phyllis Bailer was delayed, but not denied. The 1970s passed into the 1980s. Detective Morrison retired, handing the Bailer file to his replacement. New sheriffs took office in Wells County. The case file moved from active investigation to cold case storage, but it was never forgotten. Each year, investigators would pull the folder and review the evidence. Had any new techniques been developed? Were there similar crimes in other jurisdictions that might be connected? Was the child old enough to provide additional testimony? The stack of yearly case review forms grew thicker. Each report concluded the same way: no new developments. Case remains open. Phyllis's daughter grew into a teenager, then a young woman. She graduated high school, went to college, started a career. The trauma of that night became part of her foundation rather than her definition. She learned to live with unanswered questions. Her relatives kept in touch with investigators, hoping each phone call might bring news. Sometimes they received updates about new forensic techniques being developed. Most of the time, they heard the same message: "We haven't forgotten, we're still working on it." Blood samples, tissue fragments, and fiber evidence waited in carefully labeled containers. Technology had not yet caught up to their potential. In other parts of the country, forensic science was advancing rapidly. Fingerprint databases were being computerized. Ballistics analysis was becoming more sophisticated. Blood typing was evolving towards something called DNA profiling. But for Phyllis Bailer's case, these advances remained years away from practical application. The evidence waited patiently, like seeds in winter soil, for the right conditions to finally bloom into justice. The killer, wherever he was, probably believed he had gotten away with murder. Time was on his side. Witnesses forgot details. Evidence degraded. Investigators moved on to newer cases. What he couldn't know was that justice has its own timeline. And somewhere in Indiana, people who had never forgotten Phyllis Bailer were preparing for the day when science would finally speak her truth. The early 1990s brought hope to cold case investigators across America. DNA profiling was becoming a reality. The technology that had once existed only in research laboratories was starting to help solve real crimes. Detective Sarah Chen, Morrison's replacement, pulled the Bailer file from storage with renewed optimism. The biological evidence collected in 1972 might finally be useful. She contacted the state crime lab to discuss testing options. "The samples are old," the lab technician warned. "DNA degrades over time. We might get partial results at best." Chen authorized the testing anyway. After 20 years, partial results were better than no results. The DNA test results arrived 6 weeks later. The lab had successfully extracted genetic material from the evidence, but the profile was incomplete, showing only a few genetic markers. It could eliminate some suspects but wasn't detailed enough for database searches. Chen filed the results carefully in the case folder. DNA technology was improving rapidly. In a few more years, better techniques might extract more complete profiles from the same evidence. She also arranged for the child survivor, now in her early 20s, to provide a DNA sample for comparison. If future testing revealed genetic material from the perpetrator, they would need to distinguish it from the victim and her daughter. The young woman agreed readily. She had grown into a thoughtful, resilient person despite her traumatic beginning. Her memories of that night remained limited, but her desire for justice burned as bright as ever. "I don't remember much about what happened," she told Chen, "but I remember my mother's voice telling me everything would be okay. She deserves to have her story told completely." Chen promised to keep working on the case. Science was finally catching up to crimes from decades past. The Golden State Killer had been identified through DNA genealogy. Other cold cases were being solved with similar techniques. Phyllis Bailer's case would get its turn. Detective Mike Rodriguez inherited the Bailer file when Chen retired in 2005. By then, DNA technology had advanced significantly. The partial profile from the 1990s could be expanded and refined. Rodriguez was part of a new generation of investigators who had grown up with computers and databases. He understood how technology could amplify traditional detective work. He also knew that cold cases required special patience and dedication. At his retirement ceremony, Chen handed Rodriguez a box containing decades of investigative files. On top sat the Bailer case folder, now thick with reports and evidence logs. "Don't give up on her," Chen said simply. "Phyllis is still waiting for justice." Rodriguez carried the box to his office and placed it carefully on his desk. Inside the case folder, he found Morrison's original yellow legal pads, Chen's DNA testing reports, and photographs of evidence that had been waiting 33 years to speak. He also found something Chen had added: a small photograph of Phyllis Bailer holding her young daughter. The picture had been taken shortly before the murder, showing a smiling mother unaware of the danger ahead. Rodriguez pinned the photo to his bulletin board next to a handwritten sign, "Do not forget." The case would be his responsibility now. Technology continued to advance. DNA databases were growing larger. Forensic genealogy was beginning to solve seemingly impossible cases. Somewhere in those evidence bags was the key to identifying Phyllis's killer. Rodriguez was determined to find it, no matter how long it took. The child survivor had grown into a woman in her 30s, married with children of her own. She lived quietly, had built a good life despite her tragic beginning, but she never stopped wondering about that night in 1972. She kept in touch with investigators, providing updates about her life and asking about the case. Each time a new detective took over, she would meet with them to share what she remembered and to put a human face on the case file. Detective Rodriguez arranged to meet her at a coffee shop in Indianapolis. She arrived punctually, a professional woman with kind eyes that held depths of old pain. "I've been thinking about my mother a lot lately," she said. "My own daughter just turned 3, the same age I was when it happened." Rodriguez listened carefully. Sometimes cold cases broke open when families remembered new details decades later. "I watch my daughter playing and try to imagine what my mother went through that night. She must have been so scared, but she protected me anyway. Even at 3, I knew she was being brave for my sake." The woman paused, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "I want my children to know who their grandmother was, not just how she died, but how she lived. She deserves to be more than just a victim in a cold case file." Rodriguez promised to find those answers. DNA technology was advancing rapidly. Forensic genealogy was solving cases that had been cold for decades. The Golden State Killer case had shown what was possible. "We're going to solve this," he told her. "Your mother's case is a priority. We haven't forgotten her, and we never will." The woman smiled for the first time during their meeting. "Thank you. I know you'll do everything you can." As she left the coffee shop, Rodriguez watched her walk away and thought about the strength required to live with such uncertainty. She had built a good life despite never knowing who had killed her mother or why, but but she shouldn't have to live with those questions forever. Science was finally catching up to cases like Phyllis Bailer's. It was just a matter of time. In the climate-controlled evidence storage facility, Phyllis Bailer's case evidence waited in carefully maintained containers. Decades had passed, but the biological samples remained viable, blood and tissue fragments preserved at exactly the right temperature and humidity levels. Forensic archivist Janet Walsh reviewed the Bailer evidence during a routine recataloguing project. The 1972 case was remarkable for how well the original investigators had preserved everything. Detective Morrison's meticulous evidence collection was paying dividends decades later. This might still speak, Walsh whispered to herself as she examined the sealed containers. New DNA extraction techniques were being developed constantly, methods that could extract genetic profiles from increasingly small and degraded samples. The evidence that had yielded only partial results in the 1990s might reveal complete profiles with current technology. Walsh flagged the Bailer case for priority review when the next round of testing grants became available. The Indiana State Police Cold Case Unit was getting funding to re-examine old evidence with new methods. Meanwhile, genealogy databases were growing exponentially. Millions of people were submitting DNA samples to learn about their ancestry. Investigators were discovering they could use these databases to identify suspects through distant relatives. The technique required sophisticated genetic analysis and genealogical research, but it was solving cases that had seemed impossible just a few years earlier. The Golden State Killer case had grabbed national attention. Joseph James DeAngelo had been identified through his relatives' DNA profiles, ending a decades-long manhunt. Other agencies were adopting similar methods. Walsh believed the Bailer case was a perfect candidate for forensic genealogy. The evidence was well preserved. The crime was serious enough to justify the expense. The family deserved answers after waiting so long. She prepared a recommendation for Detective Rodriguez, priority candidate for advanced DNA testing and genealogical analysis. Evidence quality excellent. Case significance high. The wheels of forensic science turned slowly but surely. Phyllis Bailer's voice was finally going to be heard. The Golden State Killer case changed everything for cold case investigators. In 2018, Joseph James DeAngelo was arrested after investigators used forensic genealogy to identify him through distant relatives. The technique suddenly made decades-old cases solvable. Detective Rodriguez read every article about the case. He studied the methodology, attended training sessions, and contacted agencies that had successfully used genealogical databases. The Bailer case seemed perfect for this approach. In 2023, Rodriguez received approval and funding to partner with Identifinders International, a leading forensic genealogy firm. The company had solved dozens of cold cases using advanced DNA analysis and genealogical research. "We'll need to extract a complete genetic profile first," explained Dr. Lisa Chen, the lead genealogist assigned to the case. "If we can get enough markers, we can start building family trees through public databases." Rodriguez authorized the most advanced DNA testing available. The evidence was shipped to a specialized laboratory that could extract genetic material from challenging samples. The waiting period was agonizing. After 51 years, a few more months felt unbearable, but Rodriguez knew this might be their last best chance for justice. When the results arrived, they exceeded all expectations. The laboratory had successfully extracted a complete Y chromosome profile from the evidence, male DNA that clearly didn't belong to Phyllis or her daughter. "We've got him, Doctor," Chen said over the phone. "Whoever did this left enough genetic material for a full genealogical search." Rodriguez felt a mixture of excitement and vindication. Morrison's careful evidence collection in 1972 was finally paying off. Science had caught up to justice. The real work was just beginning. Dr. Chen would need weeks or months to trace the DNA through genealogical databases and build family trees. But for the first time in decades, they had a clear path forward. Phyllis Bailer's case was about to break wide open. Dr. Lisa Chen worked with the methodical precision of a detective and the pattern recognition skills of a mathematician. The DNA profile from the Bailer case was loaded into genealogical databases that contained millions of genetic records. Within hours, the computer identified potential relatives, distant cousins, second cousins once removed, and other family connections spanning several generations. Each match represented a thread that could lead back to the perpetrator. Chen began building family trees, working backward from the database matches. Birth records, marriage certificates, census data, and obituaries helped fill in the branches. The work was painstaking but systematic. After 2 weeks of research, a pattern emerged. Multiple DNA matches pointed toward families that had lived in Indiana during the 1970s. The geographical connection was promising. Chen narrowed her focus to male descendants of certain family lines. The Y chromosome profile could only have come from a man, eliminating half the potential suspects immediately. One family tree kept appearing in her analysis. The Lienemann family had deep roots in Indiana, and several male members who would have been the right age in 1972. Chen researched each male Lienemann descendant carefully. Most could be eliminated through age, location, or other factors. But one name kept surfacing: Fred Allen Lienemann. Born in 1943, Lienemann would have been 29 years old in 1972. Public records showed he had lived in Indiana during the early 1970s. He had a history of minor legal troubles and transient employment. Chen contacted Rodriguez with her preliminary findings. "I think we've found our suspect, but there's something you need to know." Rodriguez felt his pulse quicken. "What is it?" Fred Allen Lienemann died in 1985. He was murdered in Detroit. The revelation was shocking but not necessarily disappointing. DNA didn't lie. If Lienemann was their man, they could finally put a name to Phyllis Bailer's killer. But there would be no arrest, no trial, no opportunity for the family to see justice served in a courtroom. The case would be closed by exception, solved but unprosecutable due to the suspect's death. Chen continued her research to confirm the identification. She needed to find living relatives who could provide comparison DNA samples. The genetic evidence was strong, but court-quality confirmation required additional testing. The science that had taken 53 years to develop was finally going to give Phyllis Bailer her voice. Detective Rodriguez contacted the Detroit Police Department to learn more about Fred Allen Lienemann's death. The 1985 murder case was closed, with the perpetrator convicted and imprisoned. Lienemann had been shot during a robbery attempt. The irony was brutal. The man who had killed Phyllis Bailer had himself been murdered 13 years later. Time and violence had already delivered a kind of justice, though not the kind that would satisfy a court of law. Rodriguez studied Lienemann's background carefully. Born in rural Indiana, he had dropped out of school early and worked various manual labor jobs. He had arrests for petty theft, public intoxication, and assault. The pattern suggested someone with poor impulse control and a tendency toward violence. In the summer of 1972, Lienemann had been between jobs and staying with relatives in the area where Phyllis was killed. He owned a .38 caliber pistol, the same type of weapon used in the murder. The geographical and temporal connections were strong. The ballistics were consistent. The DNA evidence was definitive. Dr. Chen had located two of Lienemann's nephews, who were willing to provide comparison DNA samples. Both men were horrified to learn their uncle might have been a killer, but they wanted to help bring closure to the case. "If Fred did this terrible thing, the family needs to know," one nephew said. "We'll do whatever we can to help." The comparison testing took 3 weeks. When the results came back, they confirmed what the genealogical analysis had suggested. Fred Allen Lienemann was the source of the DNA found at the Phyllis Bailer crime scene. After 53 years, they had identified her killer. Rodriguez felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and frustration. The case was solved, but justice in the traditional sense was impossible. Lienemann had escaped earthly punishment by dying decades earlier, but at least Phyllis's family would have answers. The long wait for truth was finally over. Rodriguez faced the difficult task of notifying Phyllis's daughter before announcing the solution publicly. After more than 5 decades of uncertainty, she deserved to hear the news privately and have time to process it. He arranged to meet her at her home, bringing Dr. Chen along to explain the scientific details. The woman listened carefully as they explained how genealogical DNA analysis had identified her mother's killer. "Fred Allen Lienemann," she repeated slowly. "I've never heard that name before." Rodriguez showed her the photographs and background information they had gathered. Lienemann looked ordinary, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and unremarkable features. Nothing about his appearance suggested the capacity for such violence. "He lived just 20 miles from where we were attacked," she said quietly. "He probably saw us on the road and decided to." She couldn't finish the sentence. After all these years, the randomness of the crime was still difficult to accept. Dr. Chen explained the DNA evidence carefully. The genetic profile was definitive. There was no doubt about Lienemann's guilt. "What happens now?" the woman asked. Rodriguez had prepared for this question. "The case will be officially closed. We'll announce the solution publicly and file a report with the prosecutor's office. Your mother's name will be cleared from the unsolved cases list." The woman nodded slowly. Tears ran down her cheeks, but she seemed more relieved than sad. "Thank you for not forgetting her," she whispered. "Thank you for not giving up." The three of them sat in silence for several minutes, processing the magnitude of the moment. After 53 years of questions, the truth was finally known. The woman spoke again, her voice stronger. "I want people to know what kind of person my mother was. Not just how she died, but how she lived. She was a good mother, a loving daughter, a kind neighbor. She deserves to be remembered for who she was, not just what happened to her. Rodriguez promised that the public announcement would honor Phyllis's memory appropriately. This case was about more than solving a crime. It was about restoring dignity to a victim and providing closure to a family that had waited far too long for answers. The press conference was scheduled for the following week. After 5 decades of silence, Phyllis Bailer would finally have her voice. The press conference room at the Indiana State Police headquarters filled with reporters, investigators, and family members. Detective Rodriguez stood at the podium alongside Dr. Chen, the Wells County Sheriff, and representatives from Identifinders International. Phyllis's daughter sat in the front row, flanked by relatives who had waited 53 years for this moment. Her children, Phyllis's grandchildren, sat beside her, finally learning the complete story of their grandmother's life and death. Rodriguez began with a brief summary of the 1972 crime. He spoke slowly and clearly, ensuring that every detail was accurate and respectful. This was Phyllis's moment, and her story deserved to be told with dignity. Through advanced DNA testing and forensic genealogy, we have identified the person responsible for Phyllis Bailer's murder, Rodriguez announced. The perpetrator was Fred Allen Lieneman, who died in Detroit in 1985. The room buzzed with quiet conversation. Reporters scribbled notes and checked their recording devices. Family members held hands and wiped away tears. Dr. Chen explained the scientific process that had led to the identification. She emphasized how well-preserved evidence and advancing technology had made the breakthrough possible. This case demonstrates that justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied, she said. Science continues to evolve, and cold cases that seemed unsolvable yesterday may be solved tomorrow. The Wells County Sheriff praised the investigators who had worked on the case over the decades. He specifically mentioned Detective Morrison's meticulous evidence collection in 1972, which had made the DNA breakthrough possible. Phyllis Bailer was one of our own, he said. She was killed in our county, and we never stopped trying to find her killer. Today, we can finally say that justice has been served, even though it took more than 50 years. Rodriguez concluded the press conference by reading a statement from Phyllis's daughter. My mother was a loving person who deserved a full life. While we cannot bring her back, knowing the truth about what happened brings our family peace. We are grateful to everyone who worked on this case and never gave up hope. My mother's memory will live on through her family and through the commitment of investigators who never forgot her. The questions from reporters were respectful but thorough. How had the DNA been preserved so well? What other cold cases might benefit from similar analysis? Was there any evidence that Lieneman had committed other crimes? Rodriguez answered carefully, balancing the public's right to information with respect for the victim and her family. The focus remained on Phyllis, her life, her death, and the decades-long journey toward truth. As the press conference ended, family members embraced investigators and thanked them personally. The formal announcement was complete, but the emotional impact would continue for years to come. Phyllis Bailer's case was finally closed. Her voice had been heard. The news of the solved case spread rapidly across Indiana and beyond. Local television stations led their evening broadcasts with the story. Newspapers ran front-page articles about the DNA breakthrough. Social media filled with tributes to Phyllis and expressions of amazement at the power of modern forensic science. The victim's daughter found herself reading dozens of messages from strangers who had been touched by her mother's story. Many people shared their own experiences with unsolved crimes or praised the persistence of investigators who never gave up. Your mother is finally at peace, wrote one message. After all these years, the truth came out. Another reader commented, this gives me hope for my sister's case. Maybe science will catch up to her killer too. The case sparked broader conversations about cold case investigations and the importance of preserving evidence. Law enforcement agencies across the country contacted the Indiana State Police to learn about their genealogical DNA program. Dr. Chen found herself fielding calls from other investigators who wanted to apply similar techniques to their unsolved cases. The success with Phyllis Bailer's case demonstrated that even decades-old evidence could still provide answers. Every case is different, she cautioned, but the technology keeps improving. Cases that seemed impossible 5 years ago are solvable today. Local residents who remembered the 1972 murder expressed relief that the mystery had finally been solved. Many had carried fears and suspicions for decades, wondering if the killer was still among them. I locked my doors every night for years after that happened, one neighbor told a reporter. It's strange to know he was dead all this time, all that fear for nothing. Others focused on the remarkable patience of Phyllis's family and the dedication of investigators who had worked on the case. The story became a testament to the power of persistence and the importance of never giving up hope. The press coverage honored Phyllis's memory, while celebrating the triumph of justice over time. Her photograph appeared in articles alongside descriptions of her kindness and devotion to her family. She was no longer just a victim in a cold case file. She was a person whose life had mattered and whose death had finally been answered. Detective Rodriguez and his predecessor, Sarah Chen, stood together at the rural intersection where Phyllis Bailer had been killed 53 years earlier. The road looked different now, paved instead of gravel, with modern safety signs and guardrails. But the basic geography remained unchanged. Morrison used to come out here every year on the anniversary, Chen said. He felt like he owed it to Phyllis to remember. Rodriguez nodded. He understood the weight of carrying unsolved cases. Each victim became a personal responsibility, a promise that couldn't be broken, no matter how much time passed. What do you think he would say about finally solving it? Chen smiled. He'd be grateful, but he'd also say it took too long. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the cornfields. The peaceful scene was difficult to reconcile with the violence that had occurred there decades earlier. The daughter asked me something interesting, Rodriguez said. She wanted to know if we thought her mother knew somehow that we would eventually find the truth. Chen considered the question. Maybe. Families always talk about having faith that justice will come. Maybe that faith becomes real in ways we don't understand. A pickup truck passed by, the driver waving automatically at the two figures standing by the roadside. Small-town courtesy persisting across generations. Are you going to keep working cold cases? Chen asked. Rodriguez nodded. There are other families waiting for answers, other victims who deserve to have their voices heard. They walked back to their cars as darkness settled over Wells County. The intersection returned to its normal quiet, but it would never again hold the secret it had guarded for more than half a century. Phyllis Bailer's case was closed. But the work of seeking justice for the forgotten victims would continue. The woman who had lost her mother 53 years earlier drove to the small cemetery outside Bluffton where Phyllis was buried. She carried a bouquet of yellow roses, her mother's favorite flowers, and a laminated copy of the newspaper article announcing the case's solution. The granite headstone was simple. Phyllis Marie Bailer, 1946, 1972, beloved mother and daughter. Weather had darkened the carved letters, but they remained clearly readable. She knelt beside the grave and placed the flowers carefully against the headstone. The newspaper article she tucked under a small stone, protected from the wind, but visible to anyone who might visit. "We made it, Mom," she whispered. "We finally made it." The cemetery was peaceful in the late afternoon light. Birds sang in the oak trees that had grown tall since Phyllis's burial. The woman thought about all the anniversaries her family had observed here, all the prayers for justice, all the promises that they would never stop looking for answers. Her own children were adults now, with children of their own. 3 generations had been shaped by the questions surrounding Phyllis's death. Now those questions finally had answers. She thought about Detective Morrison, who had retired without solving the case, but had preserved the evidence that made justice possible. About Sarah Chen and Mike Rodriguez, who had carried the investigation forward when DNA science finally caught up. About Dr. Lisa Chen, who had traced genetic breadcrumbs back to a name and a face. Most of all, she thought about her mother, who had been 26 years old when she died, younger than the woman was now. A whole life cut short on a summer evening in 1972. "I wish you could have met your grandchildren," she said to the headstone. "They would have loved you, and you would have loved them." A gentle breeze stirred the roses and rustled the newspaper article. The woman stood slowly, her knees protesting after kneeling on the hard ground. She had one more stop to make. The Wells County Sheriff's Office occupied a modern building that hadn't existed in 1972, but the lobby displayed photographs of previous sheriffs, including Bob Jenkins, who had worked Phyllis's case in its early days. The current sheriff greeted the woman personally and led her to a conference room where several investigators had gathered. They had wanted to meet her in person after working on her mother's case for so many years. "Your mother would be proud of you," Detective Rodriguez said. "The way you've handled all this, the grace you've shown. She raised a remarkable daughter in the short time you had together." The woman smiled. She packed a lot of love into 3 years. They talked about the case, about the investigators who had worked on it over the decades, about the families who had supported each other through the long wait for justice. The sheriff presented her with a framed commendation that would be displayed in the lobby. It read, "In honor of Phyllis Marie Bailer, and in gratitude for her family's patience and faith, may her memory inspire us to never give up the search for truth." The woman accepted the honor on behalf of her mother and all the investigators who had worked so hard for so long. The case was closed, but Phyllis's legacy would continue through the commitment to solving other cold cases. As she prepared to leave, the sheriff mentioned that the Indiana State Police were establishing new protocols for cold case investigations based on lessons learned from Phyllis's case. "Your mother's case is going to help solve others," he said. That seems like a fitting way to honor her memory. The woman agreed. Justice for Phyllis had been a long time coming, but it would make justice for other victims more likely in the future. The Indiana State Police Cold Case Unit announced new protocols inspired by the successful resolution of Phyllis Bailer's case. The procedures emphasized evidence preservation, regular review schedules, and partnerships with forensic genealogy firms. A young analyst named Sarah Martinez was assigned to implement the new protocols. She had joined the unit specifically because of her interest in using advanced technology to solve old crimes. Martinez created a wall display in the unit's main office, featuring photographs of solved and unsolved cases. Phyllis Bailer's picture occupied a place of honor next to a sign reading, "Never give up." "Every case represents someone's family," Martinez explained to a visiting reporter. "Our job is to make sure they're never forgotten." The new protocols required annual reviews of all cold cases, with priority given to those that might benefit from advancing forensic techniques. Evidence preservation standards were updated to ensure that future technology would have the best possible material to work with. The unit also established formal partnerships with genealogy firms and academic institutions. Dr. Lisa Chen was named as a consulting expert, available to help with complex DNA analysis. "We learned from Phyllis's case that patience and persistence pay off," said the unit commander. "Science keeps advancing. What seems impossible today might be routine tomorrow." The protocols included provisions for family notification and support. Cold case investigations could be emotionally devastating for families, especially when they stretched across decades. The unit committed to keeping families informed and providing appropriate counseling resources. Martinez reviewed the unit's entire inventory of unsolved cases, identifying those that might benefit from the new approaches. The work was painstaking but necessary. "There are families out there who have been waiting just as long as Phyllis Bailer's family," she said. "They deserve the same commitment and the same hope." The photograph of Phyllis holding her young daughter served as a daily reminder of why the work mattered. Behind every case file was a human story, a family seeking answers, a victim waiting for justice. The protocols were implemented statewide, shared with other agencies, and published in law enforcement journals. Phyllis's case had become a model for how persistence, technology, and human compassion could combine to solve seemingly impossible crimes. The long road to justice for Phyllis Bailer had ended, but the road to justice for other victims was just beginning. The final chapter of Phyllis Bailer's story was written not in case files or court documents, but in the lives of the people who remembered her and the investigators who refused to forget. Detective Morrison's yellow legal pads were archived as historical documents, examples of thorough police work that had made justice possible decades later. His meticulous evidence collection in 1972 was cited in forensic science textbooks as a model for preserving biological evidence. Dr. Lisa Chen continued her work in forensic genealogy, solving other cold cases across the country. She kept Phyllis's photograph in her office as a reminder of why the science mattered. The victim's daughter returned to her quiet life, finally at peace with the questions that had haunted her family for 53 years. She established a memorial scholarship in her mother's name, helping other young mothers complete their education. The residents of Wells County could finally close a chapter of their community's history. The fear that had lingered for decades was replaced by relief and gratitude for the investigators who had never given up. In the evidence storage facility, the containers that had held Phyllis's case materials were carefully cleaned and prepared for the next investigation. The science that had finally given her a voice would speak for other victims in the years to come. Fred Allen Lienemann's name was added to databases of identified perpetrators, helping investigators connect patterns and close other cases. Even in death, his crimes continued to provide evidence that might help other families find closure. The press conference announcing the solution became part of journalism history, an example of how patient reporting and scientific advancement could combine to reveal long-hidden truths. Most importantly, Phyllis Marie Bailer was remembered not just as a victim, but as a person, a young mother who had loved her daughter, trusted her neighbors, and believed in the basic goodness of the world. Her life had been cut short, but her legacy lived on through the commitment to justice that her case had inspired. The photograph on the cold case unit wall showed her smiling, holding her 3-year-old daughter, unaware of the danger that lay ahead. Below the picture, someone had written, "Truth does not fade, it only waits to be found." 53 years after her death, Phyllis Bailer had finally found her voice, and through that voice, other victims would find theirs as well. The long road home had ended, but the journey toward justice for all the forgotten victims was just beginning.